All right, I think we will start here in a minute. I'll just introduce myself. Some of you may already know me. My name is Julia Brookins. I'm Special Projects Coordinator with the American Historical Association. And I'm happy that you've all been able to make it today online to hear our keynote presentation for the 2021 AHA Texas Conference on Introductory History Courses. We're happy to welcome Leonard Moore of the University of Texas at Austin to speak on teaching Black history to white people. And I will introduce our the AHA Executive Director, Jim Grossman, in a minute. I'm just going to say a few logistical things before that. All the participants are muted. If you have questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A function at any time during the presentation, and then we will address them after the presentation is over. We might, depending on time, combine or paraphrase questions. But as I said, you don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A to start writing your Q&As if you want. And the webinar is being recorded. We'll share a recording after the session. It usually takes a week or 10 days for our colleague to get that done, and she does a great job, so we don't rush her. By registering or participating in AHA's web-based events, you've agreed to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Today is no exception to that. And we've never had an issue, so I don't expect any trouble there. But I will, without further ado, introduce James Grossman, who is the AHA's Executive Director.
Good afternoon. At least I think it's the afternoon. I'm on the East Coast. When we do these things in person, this sort of thing is a lot easier. And when we do these things in person, the other great advantage is I've never met Leonard Moore, and I really wish that the opportunity that I have to introduce him also meant an opportunity to buy him lunch. But that will just have to be postponed sometime. It's a great privilege and pleasure for me to introduce Leonard Moore, who is the George Littlefield Professor of American History at the University of Texas, Austin, and the university's former Vice President of Diversity and Community Engagement. Professor Moore earned his BA from Jackson State University and his PhD from The Ohio State University. He's taught at Louisiana State University. Those of us who watch a lot of college football are accustomed to people being introduced as coming from Louisiana State University, but the Ohio State University. We can get into that another time. That's another issue with higher education. He taught at LSU before arriving at UT in 2007. At the University of Texas, he teaches a class on the Black Power movement and a course titled Race in the Age of Trump. And Professor Moore has written 4 books, but those 4 books aside, what's really impressive about this man is that in these 2 courses, he teaches more than 1,000 students. And when you think about that in terms of the influence that someone has over the course of a career, we all know that even when we do really, really well, most of us might sell 10,000, 20,000 copies of a book. Professor Moore hits that in a decade or 2 in terms of the students in the classroom. That's where we have our influence. When we have students hopefully listening to us, thinking about what we say, and 1,000 students a year is a lot. He also directs study abroad programs in Cape Town, Beijing. We'll talk about that sometime when we have that lunch, and Dubai. Since 2013, he has taken more than 2,400 students abroad. Professor Moore also has won the John Warfield Teaching Award in 2008 at UT. He is the recipient of the Eyes of Texas Teaching Award in 2013. We can talk about that one over lunch too. What I'm especially impressed by as a teacher, and this is a conference about teaching, is Professor Moore winning the 2015 Texas Top 10 Best Professors. And it's one thing to be one of the top 10 professors in a state where there's one flagship university, 7 or 8 regional universities. It's another thing to be one of the top 10 professors in the state of Texas, which not only which has actually more than one university system, research university system, which is unusual in and of itself. He has also won in 2015 an award for excellence in teaching, and in 2020 was the recipient of an award for creative student engagement. I've never met anybody else who's won an award for creative student engagement, so we'll have to discuss that one too. Professor Moore is the author of 4 books on Black politics: The Defeat of Black Power, Civil Rights, and the National Black Political Convention of 1972, Black Rage in New Orleans, Police Brutality and African American Activism from World War II to Hurricane Katrina, and Carl B. Stokes and the Rise of Black Political Power in America. And then most recently, Teaching Black History to White People, which is the subject of today's lecture. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize to this group is the challenges of writing a book like that and giving lectures on that topic. This often is one of the elephants in the room in academia. The identity issues of professors, the identity issues of students. As a white man who taught Black history for many years, there are questions that often arose that people didn't want to talk about. And I personally am really looking forward to reading Professor Moore's book and hearing this lecture, because he is dealing with questions that a lot of people don't want to talk about, but that need to be talked about clearly and honestly. So I'm going to turn this over to Leonard Moore.
Professor Grossman, thank you so much. I want to thank Julia, the team for setting this all up, and Claire, and thank you all for agreeing to reschedule. So my name is Leonard Moore, and just as some ground rules, I don't take myself that seriously. I like to have fun. I'm very, very student-centered. I've been like that my whole career. I never understood why anybody would want to take a sabbatical. I never understood why anybody would want to have any time off or leave to do what? I get my love from walking in the classroom and engaging with 18 to 23-year-olds. And I like to say it's reverse mentoring. I think I pour into them. And I say this all the time, when I teach those 1,000 students, in the fall semester when I teach, it's like, they help me become a better husband, a better father. So it's mutual, and it is a lot of fun. So first, let me talk about how I became a history major and how I became a professor, because I think in many ways that'll really allow you to see, how I operate and why I operate the way I do. So I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I finished high school with a 1.6 grade point average and a 15 on the ACT. Cleveland Heights, Ohio was a little working class suburb right outside Cleveland. And so there was always an expectation I would go to college, all right? So with a 1.6 GPA, 15 ACT, check this out now. I never heard my name called at a school assembly from kindergarten all the way to graduation, all right? And so they called it graduation day, but I never heard my name called for anything, any kind of academic recognition whatsoever. What was interesting, my dad finished at Case Western Reserve University, 1955, but school was just kind of boring to me. So I go to Jackson State University, an historically Black college, and when I get there, I decide to be an elementary education major, all right? The first class, the first day of the semester, we took like this little intro to education class. I'm like, to hell with this, I'm going to change my major, and I decided to be a history major, because that's the only thing I ever loved. And people laughed at me, why would you be a history major? You can't make any money, blah, 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 but that's what I loved. And so I left Jackson State, went to Cleveland State, got a master's degree in history, and my whole goal was to go be a high school history teacher. I thought I would be great at it. I looked forward to it. So I didn't even know this idea. I didn't even know what a PhD kind of meant or was. Now, what's ironic is that my dad's sister had a PhD in clinical psychology from Michigan, and his another sister had a doctorate from USC, Southern Cal. So it was in my family, but I really just didn't even know what it was. I didn't really understand how you became a professor until I was at Cleveland State University. It was a master's only program, and I was a teaching assistant. And Professor, Joyce Thomas. She wrote a great dissertation on Black women during World War II, and I worked with her over the course of a year. And I'm like, man, I could be a professor. I could do this. So I applied to 5 PhD programs: Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, Illinois, and Missouri. Now, this is pre-email. So I got 2 rejection letters back on the same day from Michigan and Michigan State. The next day in the mail came a rejection letter from the University of Illinois. So then it came down to Missouri and Ohio State. And I said, hell, I gotta find something out, because if I don't get in, I gotta get on with my life, and start applying for some teaching jobs. So I called Ohio State, and the lady said, well, Mr. Moore, we haven't sent out the decisions yet. I said, well, have you made the decision? She said, yes, Mr. Moore, we've made them, but I can't show you anything over the phone. You have to wait to get something in the mail. I said, miss, I completely understand, but I'm over here going crazy. I got 3 rejection letters in the last 2 days, and I just need to know, if I didn't get in, I need to move on with my life. And you could feel through the phone, she said, just a second, and you could see like she was going down the paper. She said, what's your name? I said, Leonard Moore. I said, Moore? She said, Moore. I said, Moore, yes, Moore. She said, you got in? I said, are you serious? She said, yes. The next day, I drove to Ohio State, introduced myself to her, walked around the campus, and I told myself, man, when I get up here in the fall, I'm gonna kill it. So that is how I became a professor. I started at Ohio State in '94, got my PhD in '98. But for many of us who are African-American getting our PhDs during that period, this is important. It seemed like during that time period, a lot of Black people, a lot of Black professors weren't getting tenure. A mixture of discrimination. Some of them just weren't publishing. But a lot of that hovered over a lot of us during that period. And so a lot of me and my peers across the country, we said one thing we weren't going to do. We were going to publish. We were going to try to publish more than our peers, because we never wanted tenure to become an issue. So I wanted to give you that background. So when I get my PhD, I take my first job at Louisiana State University. Now, what is interesting is I go to LSU primarily because the weather was warm. My grandmother lived there, and they had a rogue football team. While I was at Ohio State as a PhD student, I did a lot of tutoring with football players, mentoring, and I knew that was one aspect of the experience that I wanted to continue when I became a professor. So I get to LSU, and I remember at the time, LSU may have had 12 Black faculty members, and I remember one time, like 8 or 9 of us went to lunch, and I said, hell, we better not get in a car accident, because they won't have any Black faculty. So when I start teaching Black history at Louisiana State University, I would say first couple years, my classes are 70 to 80% African-American, right? And I remember one time I had about 15 Black students in my office, class full of Black students, football players in the class and all that. And I remember a Black professor telling me, he said, well, Leonard, man, if I was you, I wouldn't have all those Black students in my class. I said, what? He said, yeah, man, it's not a good look. And especially, man, I would never have a lot of football players in my class either. And I remember asking him, why not? I said, I got a PhD to teach Black history. I want to inspire students, inspire African-American students. But now you're telling me that it's not a good look. Who is it not a good look to? He said, well, Leonard, the people will perceive your class as not being intellectually rigorous. I said, they don't perceive it as rigorous anyway. So I said, I'm gonna do what I do, and whoever signs up for my class, that's who takes it. But I think those of us who teach Black history or any form of Black studies, there's always been this debate, is it respected in the academy? I couldn't worry about people's perceptions. I knew my motives were pure. I knew I was going to use it to motivate and inspire students, and I didn't care what anybody else thought or perceived issue of rigor and that kind of stuff. I said, I'm not going to discriminate against those students just because they are Black, and that's what you are asking me to do. All right, let me move on. So anyway, I come to Texas in 2007, and when I first get here, nobody knew me. I like teaching large classes. I typed up some information about my class, and during orientation or during registration prior to school starting, guess what I did? I spent a couple days walking all around campus, passing out flyers to students introducing myself. Hey, my name is Dr. Moore. Take my Black Power class. It'll be the best class you take here at UT. Hey, my name is Dr. Moore. You ever had a Black professor before? They'd be like, no, come take my Black history class. Hey, my name is Dr. Moore. Have you ever taken a Black history class before? No, I've never taken one. Well, come take my class. You'll love it. And so over time, I would say initially, the class was about maybe 50% white. No, not 50% white. It was initially maybe majority African-American, but over time, right, it has become majority white. And that's precisely because upper class students register first for the course. And at a majority white university, you're going to have more white students who are juniors and seniors. And so they register for the class first. So that's why now the class is majority white. If you walk in my classroom today at 3:30, when I teach today at 3:30, the class will be about 50% white, about 20% Black, 20% Latino, and about 10% Asian. And what I tell people when you come take my class, and this is where some of the woke left get mad at me, I tell them, my class is not a safe space. There will be no trigger warnings. And I really believe in freedom of speech in this class. I believe in it. And what I tell them is you can't get mad at somebody because they express a viewpoint you disagree with. And they were like, Dr. Moore, and I said, no, we won't have any hateful language. We won't allow people to incite violence, but you have to be comfortable in an environment where people are expressing a view that you disagree with. Now, here is why I like teaching in the Deep South, and I just want to give an example. In the South, I believe we don't have an issue. I don't think we have as much of an issue talking about race in the South as we do in the Northeast and the West Coast. And let me explain what I mean before you all look at me like I'm crazy. I had an interview at the University of Oregon about 5 or 6 years ago. It was for a vice president's job for diversity. So I fly there and I'm interviewing with the committee and they say, well, Leonard, what is your greatest accomplishment as an administrator? And I said, well, I have several. They said, the one you're most proud of. I said, well, we have done a good job at bringing more Black males to the campus, and we have in many ways shrunk the gap between African-American women on campus and African-American men on campus. And I told them I'm very, very proud of that. The response from a faculty member at the University of Oregon, and this is the typical liberal response, he said, well, Leonard, that seems very gendered and very sexist to me. Now, in what world would anybody have a problem with more Black men going to college? And so my point is, in the South, you've got to grapple with it. They're used to dealing with Black folk in Texas and in Louisiana. You got to grapple with it. So people are surprised, man, you teaching this in the South? And I'm like, yeah, I've never had a problem teaching Black history in the South. And let me tell you why I like teaching in the South. Number one, I always get skeptical parents. There's a white girl who took my class 3 years ago, and she said, Dr. Moore, my mom didn't want me to take your class. I said, okay, why not? She said, well, when she saw what class I signed up for, she said, don't let that Black professor turn you into a liberal. I said, well, who said I was a liberal? I said, I'm a Democrat. I don't know if liberal is the right label. And I said, well, what convinced her to allow you to take the class? She said, well, my mom told me I could take the class. I said, so what do you have to do? She said, well, Dr. Moore, my mom has the syllabus. She bought all the books. And every day after lecture, I have to take a picture of the notes and I have to send them to her. And every Tuesday and Thursday night after your class, me and my mom discuss the course. Now this is helicopter parenting on a whole different level. Here's how God works. At the end of the semester, I get this email from a mom. She said, Dr. Moore, you may not know this. My daughter was in your class this semester. I did not want her to take your class. I thought you were going to try to indoctrinate her, and I thought you were going to basically turn her into a liberal. And she wanted to describe how she got the books, she read the books, she went over the course notes. She said, Dr. Moore, thank you for this experience. You have changed my entire family's outlook on the Black community. So that's number one, why I like teaching in the South. I also like teaching in the South because if you have an example where someone likes what you do, you have these other examples where people don't sometimes appreciate teaching Black history. But in the South, people will tell you. Every Black History Month, I go to a local high school, and they know I'm coming. And here's the funny thing. Whenever I go, You would think that I'm a terrorist of some sort. So whenever I go to this high school, been going for 7 or 8 years for Black History Month, the principal gives the students an opt-out waiver, where if the parents don't want them taking part in the Black History lecture, they can opt out and they can go to study hall or do something like that. So one day I go to the school, and the way it works is we'd be in an auditorium and they would bring 3 or 4 classes down at a time, throughout the course of the day. And I walked in the auditorium and I saw an older white guy, and I said, oh, I've seen this movie before. And I knew what it was before I saw it. Here's what it was. It was a parent of a kid who wanted to come check it out. So I'm lecturing, I'm doing my thing, I think I'm killing it, and this white man is sitting at the back of the room, visibly agitated, all right? When I finish lecturing, he has the unmitigated gall to come up to me and tell me, he said, I really wish you would take this as an opportunity to unify people, but your lecture is very divisive. I said, man, first of all, get the hell out of my face, number one. And number two, this is the hubris of you or this entitlement attitude that you have gonna come and tell me how I need to give this Black History lecture. It's number two. Number three, third thing about how people in the South will come at you straight up. But I like it because now you can have open and honest conversation. So I went to there's an elite suburb in Austin called the Lakeway. It's called Lakeway, a very, very elite suburb in Austin, wealthy suburb. So I was invited by a group called, listen to the name of this group now, the Lakeway Men's Club. All right, now, when I said Lakeway Men's Club, a certain image went in your mind, and that's it. I walk in 7 in the morning on a Tuesday morning. I take 2 of my Black male grad assistants with me because I knew I might need some bodyguard protection getting out of there. So I show up at 7 in the morning. It's about 105 white men. And they said, Dr. Moore, you can speak about whatever you want. So before they introduce me, one guy gets up and starts passing out my bio. 11 people immediately get up and walk out. And here's what I told my grad assistants. I said, hey, y'all, check this out. They're expecting me to talk about race. They're going to expect Black Lives Matter. I said, guess what? I'm not going to say anything about race. I'm not going to say anything about Black history. I'm going to just talk about these amazing experiences we have when we take students abroad. All right? So talk for 25 minutes. They give me a polite applause. During the question and answer, the first hand goes up. A white guy from New York City. He identified himself. He said, Leonard, I'm Jewish. Dr. Moore, I'm a Jewish guy from New York City who moved here 3 years ago. He said, I got a question. I said, yes, what's your question? He said, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? I said, sir, I didn't say anything about Black Lives Matter. I don't know if you were told I was going to talk about it, but I talked about the globalization of higher education and these amazing experiences we have. We take kids abroad. And I said, however, I can tell you have been waiting to ask this question to a Black person for several years, so you got your opportunity. He said, well, I don't really have a question. I have more of a statement. I said, sir, what's your statement? He says, if you all would obey the police, you wouldn't get shot. Straight up. I appreciated him being forthright because now when he came at me like that, I could come right back at him. And then we started talking. I said, let me ask you a question. Are you a football fan? He said, yes. I said, are there bad football coaches? He said, absolutely. I said, are there bad business owners? Absolutely. Are there bad investment bankers? Absolutely. So how come there can't be bad police officers? And so why I like teaching in the South, because they are often unfiltered, but when you come back at them, I believe you can have oftentimes a very, very fruitful discussion. Last one and we'll move on. My daughter was in competitive cheer about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm warning you, that's a very expensive sport. So if your daughter expressed interest in it, make sure you have the checks to pay. That stuff is expensive. They do the same routine all season. Then you get to the tournament and the pyramid falls, and it's like, wow, we got to do this all again the next month at another tournament. But so we're sitting there, and white guys, he's another parent. We're sitting each other talking. And he says, well, Leonard, what do you do for a living? Now, whenever I tell you what I do for a living, there is always some awkward pause. I say, well, man, I'm a professor at UT. He says, UT Austin? And I'm like, yes, UT Austin. But he says it with a question mark, okay? I'm like, yeah, UT Austin. Then he says, what do you teach? I say, man, you know, I'm a history professor. What classes do you teach? Here's what I said, man, I teach 2 classes. I teach a class on the Black Power movement, and I teach a class called Race in the Age of Trump. And guess what happens when I mention those 2 classes? The pause is so awkward. Often the conversation is over. People don't know how to proceed. And so the conversation stopped. He comes back to me after lunch. He said, well, Leonard, can I ask you a question? I said, sure. He said, I want to talk about y'all admissions policy at the University of Texas. And I said, okay. Then he proceeds to say this. I don't mean to be offensive. Now, if somebody ever prefaces a statement by saying, I don't mean to be offensive, they're about to be. He says, I don't mean to be offensive, but I don't like this automatic admissions rule. So for a long time here at UT, if you were the top 10% in your graduating class, you got into the university automatically, all right? So it's now it's top 6%, okay? He said, well, you know, my daughter is at Westlake High School, a very competitive high school, one of the best high schools in the state, but she's not in the top 10%. I said, okay. He said, but you know what? If she was at one of those inner city schools or at one of those Mexican schools along the border, she would be valedictorian. I said, man, you know what? That is a very, very interesting point you bring up. I said, but have you ever considered that if she went to an inner city school in Houston or Dallas, or if she went to a school in the valley along the border, that whole circumstances may be different? And he said, Leonard, man, I never looked at it that way. So my point is, I like the South because I think you can have open and honest conversations. And that's what I appreciate. I don't need anybody sugarcoating. I like being in Texas because people will come straight at you. Last story, and we're gonna move on. So every year, when my kids were in middle school, they would have a career day, all right? And I would always go to the career day and be a speaker, you know, and people often assume that because I worked at the University of Texas, that I was a football coach or some kind of way affiliated with athletics, like no, I'm a professor. So one day, a couple of years ago, my son was in 7th grade. I go up there and we're talking, and the majority of the students, they can pick where they want to go. So the majority of the students want to come to me because my daughter, Lauren, was very popular. We're going to hear Lauren's dad. And we begin to have this very, very fruitful discussion with middle school kids about police brutality. The discussion was amazing. The teachers loved it. The students loved it. 2 days after that, I'm at my office on campus. I'm in my administrative office on campus. One of the student workers said, well, Dr. Moore, there's somebody on the phone for you. I said, who is it? So I got it. He said, yes. Are you Dr. Moore? I said, yes. I said, did you speak at Walsh Middle School the other day? I said, absolutely. He said, well, I didn't appreciate what you had to say about the police. I said, what did I say about the police? Well, my daughter came home and she said, you said you hate the police. I said, do you believe that? And so he wants to come at me crazy, but again, he came at me and I came right back at him. I said, sir, here is the issue. Why can't you accept that in this country where everything is racialized, that Black people have a different perspective on certain institutions? So while your experience with law enforcement maybe has been 100% positive, it hasn't been that way with us. But no, there was never any talk about hating the police, all right? So I like being in Texas because people will come at you, but I'll come right back. All right, so let's move on. So in my Black Power class, I have the students do an assignment. First week of class, and this is gonna blow y'all away. It's called How the Black Experience Has Shaped Me. So I said, y'all gotta write a 2-page reflection paper on how the Black experience has shaped you. Now, Black students are good, but a lot of other students don't know it. Dr. Moore, how do I write this paper? I'm not Black. I said, you will figure it out. I mean, let's talk about, you know, do you have Black friends? You go around Black people? I said, you will figure it out. And so what typically happens is the students often talk about, you know, their first encounter with race, i.e. Blackness, in this case, growing up. And the number one theme that emerges from all of these papers, students from Somalia, Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, all throughout South South America, students from Pakistan, India, China, Japan, and white students, the number one theme that emerges is that all of them, even the large immigrant groups, all of them were taught, don't be like Black people. That's number one. A lot of them were taught, don't be like Black people, and a lot of immigrants were told, don't be like Black people. And another theme was that dark skin was bad. You would be surprised at how many of my students from Asia and from Mexico and El Salvador were inundated with this message from parents and grandparents that you don't want your skin to get too dark, get out of the sun. Just this idea that white, was pure, that whiteness in many ways was the standard by which they all should be measured. So I gave a lecture to the American Association of Realtors, big realtors group, all right? About 200 realtors on the call, majority white, killed it. When the lecture was over, I get an email. The email says, Dr. Moore, I am Chinese, but I grew up in Jamaica, and I came to the States 10 years ago. Your lecture was despicable. You are divisive. I feel sorry for your students. Listen to this. I feel sorry for your students. You shouldn't be teaching, and you are indoctrinating them to hate America. Now, what's interesting is I get a lot of similar emails and messages from immigrants, not just those who came recently, those who've been here a while. And it amazes me how somebody, not even from this country, wants to tell me how I should teach and interpret the history of my people. And it's funny, on that call, there were hardcore white conservatives, Trump supporters, QAnon, all that on the call. None of them seemed to register an official complaint. But this one person did. And she told me, like I said, I was indoctrinating students, that I was despicable, and that she would hate to be in my classroom. All right, let's move on. So, y'all good? We still there? I can't see anybody. I can't anything. But I'm looking at the number. I haven't seen the number. The numbers go down. So I guess y'all are still with me. All right, Julia, what's up? Yep. Oh, you just waving? Okay, thank you, Julia. I need to see somebody. All right, here we go. So let me talk about, shift gears for the next 10 minutes or so, and talk about some of the things I like to highlight when I'm teaching Black history to white people. For the last 3 Tuesdays, I'm teaching a Black history class with about 100 white judges in the state of Texas. Now, these are rural judges, West Texas, Panhandle, all that kind of stuff, right? And this is their first exposure to Black history. But what I told them is that when you are on the bench, you cannot, in my mind, unless you understand the Black experience, how can you make sure that Black defendant is getting a fair trial? All right, let me move on. So some of the things I like to emphasize to white people when I'm teaching Black history. First thing I like to emphasize is what I call the Juneteenth generation, right? This generation of formerly enslaved people who make that transition from slavery to freedom. And here's what I do for my business students when I teach an MBA program. I say, imagine if you work for McKinsey or one of these consulting firms, and your responsibility was to basically draft a proposal or a strategy, follow me now, to help 4 million formerly enslaved people make a successful transition from slavery to freedom in the place of their oppression, all right? They look at me, and so when we talk about the Juneteenth generation, this is my biggest issue with Tom Brokaw. He said the greatest generation was the World War II generation. No, I think the greatest generation of Americans was this Juneteenth generation, and let me tell you why. There are basically 5 or 6 things this Juneteenth generation will do, and we don't look, and I call it the birth of Black creatives. We don't look at them as creative people. The first thing they do, they move off the plantation. The second thing they do, they change their name. The third thing they do, they rebuild their families. The fourth thing they do, they acquire property. The fifth thing they do, they establish churches. And the sixth thing they do, they build educational institutions. These are formerly enslaved people. And I remind people that when General Sherman in 1864 met with a group of Black freedmen in Savannah. And he basically asked them, what is it you want when the war is over? They didn't want welfare. They didn't want to live in public housing projects. They didn't want food stamps. They didn't want to live off the government. The number one thing they wanted, they said, we want some land and we want to be left alone. That is what they said. And that's where you get this whole idea of 40 acres and a mule from, all right? But that's what they wanted. But we know shortly after emancipation, you get the Black codes, then you get Jim Crow as a mechanism to get them back on the plantation. When we talk about the Jim Crow period, I got to remind white people and my white students, I said, you have to understand the Jim Crow period. You were talking about a system that basically controlled African-American life from like 1870 up to about 1960. The first thing they did, they come up with segregation as a psychological mechanism that now that you were free, they had to find a way, right? So that Black people would constantly be reminded of their inferiority. The second thing you do, you begin to manipulate the criminal justice system. To get them back on the plantation, you come up with convict leasing to get them back on the plantation. The third thing you do, you have this economic system called sharecropping that leads to perpetual indebtedness. The fourth thing they do, you restrict the Black vote. I always ask white people, if you got the 15th Amendment, and then you got the 19th, which amendment gave women the right? The 1920 Amendment gave women the right to vote. What are Black people marching for in the 1960s? If those two amendments have granted them the right to vote, what are they marching for? And so we know that the voter suppression was real. The right to vote was taken away from them. Grandfather clause, all that kind of stuff, poll tax, violence and intimidation. And the last thing we talk about with the Jim Crow period is I show very graphic depictions of African Americans being lynched. They are very graphic. They are very, very graphic. Now, some of my students don't like it. Some of my Black students don't like it. And they say, Dr. Moore, that's trauma porn. I'm saying, let me tell you something. I said, whenever I watch a documentary about the Holocaust, they always show the graphic images of Jewish bodies stacked on top of each other, things of that nature. I said, and I really believe, having grown up in a Black and an Orthodox Jewish community, that they're deliberate. They want people to see how they were treated by Nazi Germany and these other folks back during World War II, 1930s and 1940s. And so some people don't like it, like, no. And we discuss lynching. We talk about what effect does that have on Black people? What effect does it have on white people who are there in many ways dismembering a Black corpse? And the room goes silent. And I tell them, this is American history, raw and uncut. All right, let's move on. Now, also Jim Crow, we talk about how, the lost cause narrative and how the first wave of Confederate monuments, I believe, was put up in the early part of the 20th century as those Confederate veterans were dying off. But we end the period of Jim Crow talking about the massive institution building that took place in the Black community. Over 90% of our historically Black colleges and universities were established during the Jim Crow period. Pretty much 95% of all the major Black church denominations established during the Jim Crow period. The 8 prominent African-American fraternities and sororities established during the Jim Crow period. Pretty much every African-American professional organizations, teachers, dentists, attorneys, physicians, bankers, morticians, life insurance, most African-American professional organizations were built during the Jim Crow period. And so I emphasize that to show, despite the terror of the period, despite Black folk being terrorized, they still did an immense amount of institution building. And what I do, I contrast it to now. I say now, much of our power as Black people is built around personalities, but during the Jim Crow period, it was built around institutions, and we know institutions outlive people. All right, a couple more things, and we're gonna question and answer. Now, when we talk about the Jim Crow period, now I want to leave us with this before we talk about the Great Migration briefly. I love to use a monopoly example, and we talk about the Second Great Migration. We'll talk about police brutality, education, employment. But when we really talk about the second great migration, both of them, we talk about the housing discrimination that took place and the legacy of that and how it affected African-American wealth building over the last 30, 40, 50 years. I want to give two personal examples before I go to that. My dad bought our house in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, 1963, 1964. He was probably within the first 15 or 20 African-American homeowners in Cleveland Heights. When they moved there, our next door neighbor was Ernest Cooper, who was president and director of the Cleveland Urban League. So it was a place Black folk were moving to when they got a little money. All right, follow me. And I said, Dad, you know, I was born in '71, so you know I wasn't born when they moved there. I said, Dad, you know, when you bought the house here, did you look at houses anywhere else? He said, yeah, I looked in Shaker Heights, but I knew they wouldn't let me buy there. That's what he said. I knew they wouldn't let me buy a house there. Now, Black man, got a finance degree, Case Western Reserve, 1955, worked for the Internal Revenue Service. They won't let him buy a house in Shaker Heights, has the income, but because of his race, won't let him buy a house there. And I said, what about, did you look at any other house in Cleveland Heights? He said, no, I knew that if they were gonna let me move to Cleveland Heights, it was gonna be on one or two streets, all right? And so it was funny because our part of Cleveland Heights was known as the Black part, even throughout my 18, 19 years of living there before I went to college. My father-in-law, my wife is from Pasadena, California. And if you've ever been to the Rose Bowl, you can walk from her house to the Rose Bowl and be there in 10 minutes. My father-in-law moved to Pasadena, California, 1956, buys a house in Pasadena, California, 10 minutes from the Rose Bowl, but it's not one of the big houses he wanted to buy. He had to buy a small 1,300 square foot bungalow. The reason I tell those stories because the house my father-in-law wanted to buy is probably worth about $3.1 million now. The house he had to buy is worth about $700,000. And so the students like, well, Dr. Moore, what does all this mean? I said, so let's look at the game of Monopoly. I'm a big Monopoly player, y'all. Maybe when I come to the AHA in New Orleans, we can sit in the lobby and play Monopoly. I love Monopoly. I am good at it. So here we go. Here's the game of Monopoly, how you play it. So I say, Monopoly can explain the legacy of state-sanctioned discrimination and racism in America. They say, Dr. Moore, how do you mean? I say, okay. So let's say we all sit down to play Monopoly. I'm the only Black person playing, and I'm playing with 6 of my white coworkers. Before the game starts, everybody gets $1,500. They give me $700. We pick our little piece. You got the shoe, the thimble, the iron, the horse, the car, whatever. And they say, okay, we're ready to play. And I'm educated. I think I'm a good negotiator. I know I can make deals, and I think I'm gonna win the game. But before the game starts, they say, well, Leonard, we got one set of rules. We got an extra rule for you because you're Black. What is it? Leonard, you cannot buy any property until you roll for the 20th time. What do you mean? I said, no, that's not the rule. They said, here it is. You can't buy any property until you roll for the 20th time. But guess what? You can go around the board, you can pay taxes, you can pay rent when you land on people. And of course, since you are Black, you can go to jail. And if you land on free parking, you don't get any of that money. Okay, so even despite the obstacle, I think I'm still smart. So I roll the dice and I'm excited. When I roll for the 20th time, I can get in the game and I'm gonna kill it. What has happened to the game when I am rolling for the 20th time? All the property has been purchased. There is no more property for me to buy. I can't buy the purples, I can't buy the blues, I can't buy the oranges or the reds or the yellows or the maroons or the light blues. All the property is gone. So now Julia comes into, she's observing the game, and they're like, well, Leonard, how come you don't have any money? And I'm like, because they discriminated against me. Nah, man, they didn't discriminate against you. You're just lazy. You didn't work hard enough. And I'm like, no, you weren't here at the beginning of the game when they said the rules were different. So now we've been playing for 2 hours. I have no money. I have no property. We get up, decide to do something else. And guess what? Our children come and take our place at the game. So my white colleagues, they have their money and property. They pass it down to their kids. Leonard Moore has no money or property. I have nothing to pass down to my kids. And so when my daughter sits in my chair to continue the Monopoly game, all her friends say, Lauren, how come you don't have any money or property? And she says, because y'all were racist toward my dad. And they say, Lauren, that happened a long time ago. We had nothing to do with that. When I give the Monopoly example, even my biggest critics can't fight it, and they begin to understand. And what I like to emphasize broadly is that despite the oppression Black folk have suffered in America, we have always come back, always been very resilient, been very, very creative, understood the importance of community and family and institution building. And so like Marcus Garvey said, he said, the teaching of Black history should have two main purposes. Number one, to show white America how they have treated Black people. And number two, to inspire Black people to overcome the odds and pursue greatness. All right? So Julie, we'll take some questions now. All right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have some questions and a lot of momentum, I think. I like you, I'm only looking at 3 people on the screen, but okay. I'm sensing the energy here. I'm getting texts from people who are on the line, which is good. So we have one that's just a thank you. And then we have another one that is, how do you respond to students when they ask, why was I never taught this, i.e. about the Black experience before?
Here's what I tell them. I tell them, and I am very, very hard on elite white parents who put their kids into all white academic environments. I understand why Black people move to all white environment because they're trying to get some social capital. But what I tell students is that your parents didn't value Black history. They didn't even value you going to school with Black people. So here you are now as a sophomore, junior, or maybe a senior in college, and you don't know how to connect with people who look different than you. And let me tell you this, when we take our kids abroad, the students who have the biggest, who struggle the most, so we take our kids to Beijing the first day, we play The Amazing Race, and our goal is to deliberately get them lost in a city of 30 million people, all right? And so it is the Latino students from the Valley, they can function. The Black kids, Houston and Dallas are fine. It's the elite white kids who have been sheltered and coddled their entire life, who often don't know how to function in another environment. They may be able to function in Paris or Berlin, but they can't function in Cape Town, they can't function in Beijing, and they can't function in the United Arab Emirates. And so what I tell them is that we can't go back and change the past, but you're in this class now, and go home and ask your parents why they put you in a school with all white people, and then let me know the response.
All right, we have a question from someone. Jason Morgan says he TA'd for you multiple times while at UT in the Black Power class. And he felt that white students were open to discussions on race in the past because they only had to recognize the racism of the past, but not think as deeply about it today or their role in the current system. How different are the reactions you get in the class focusing on current events like race in the age of Trump?
What I found, so thank you, Jay. So my approach to teaching is a little different. So like in my class at 3:30 today, I'll have a whole bunch of white fraternity boys in the class. Now, why are they in the class? They heard it was a good class. They probably said, man, you can go in there and argue with Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore will let you say whatever you want to say in class. But here's the thing I like to class. It's an aspirational approach. Here's what I tell them. Because a lot of these guys want to work on Wall Street, and I'm just using that as an example, that population. I'm like, man, if you want to work on Wall Street, you got to learn how to connect with people, plain and simple. I mean, you can be in this all-white suburban Texas bubble if you want, but you will not be able to function if you go to Chicago or New York City or San Francisco. You've got to know how to connect with people. So I spin it as, this is professional development for you. You need this. You need to learn about the Black experience, because if you don't learn about the Black experience, and I'm gonna say this, if you don't learn about the Black experience, then you will have trouble learning about every other ethnic group in America, and you will always be behind the curve. So it is very much an aspirational approach I take with students who are initially resistant.
Thank you. We have another question Your Monopoly example was brilliant. And this, the question is from Dale Smith, has tried to explain the FHA redlining for years. Now they have a tool for that. And is it in your recent book? So that
Yes,
they
I talked about that. And here's the thing about those FHA redlining maps. I think you said his name was Dale. Dale, here's the thing what I do with white people. You got to show them the documents. You got to show it. So it's not about indoctrination. I tell people I don't teach critical race theory. I teach critical race facts. And what I have learned when I am going through this demonstration about housing discrimination, and I show them the redlining map, and I show them a restrictive covenant that says this house cannot be rented, sold, leased to a Negro or someone of Semitic origin, talking about Jews. When they see it, and when they see signs like keep this neighborhood white, when they see a handbill that says keep Black people out, we don't want our girls to get raped. When they see that kind of stuff, you can't deny it. You cannot deny it. So a good teacher, you don't have to preach, just put the documents up and the students can come to the conclusion for themselves.
Thank you.
Man, I'm working up a sweat in here.
You're under those lights. I think that might have something to do with it.
Okay.
Davida Goldberg, it says, I've heard people turn your point about institution building in the Jim Crow era and using those facts about Black success into a proof that segregation was positive and functional, and that desegregation was a tragedy, was the tragedy. Have you heard this, and what response might you have?
Davida, we do need to have an honest discussion about desegregation. I mean, it's long overdue. And, you know, the more and more I look into this Supreme Court decision, NAACP stuff, you don't really see a lot of African-American parents demanding that their kids be taught by white people or demanding that their kids go to school with white people. I think they were making an equity argument. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You can take the most conservative Black person in America whose kid may be at some elite school, let's say one of those elite school boarding schools in the Northeast, Andover, or something like that. Even those parents want their kid to have to interact with Black teachers because we know how vital it is. Now, here's the thing about school desegregation. Black teachers in the Black community predicted this stuff in the 1940s. Here's what they said. They said, if the schools are integrated, there will be three major results. Number one, Black schools will get closed, and that happened. Number two, Black teachers will lose their jobs en masse, and that happened. And they said, number three, this is the biggest one, teaching as a profession amongst Black people will rapidly decline. And all three of those things happened. And so the question is, why do we still celebrate 1954? Why do we still celebrate it? We need to begin, in many ways, reevaluate that whole Supreme Court decision. We got about 75 years of evidence now, right? And having grown up in a household with a mom who was from rural Washington Parish, Louisiana, and a dad from Cleveland, Ohio, who never went south until he met my mom in 1958. He said he was never going to the South. But having grown up, I look at now how my mom, whenever she would go back to Louisiana, to that all Black rural community, it meant something to her. A high percentage of land ownership in that community. And so having grown up in both, in a household with a mom from the segregated South and a dad from the allegedly integrated urban North, we got to reevaluate that whole period. I really believe those Black educators were prophetic, and I believe we really need to go back and honor them because what we're witnessing now is what they predicted.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The next comment is thank you so much for the amazing presentation. That Regina L is a journalist and also a history graduate student at UTA. I'm not sure if she means Austin, or probably Arlington.
Okay.
And this has been a wonderful experience. And then another question, when discussing the moments where barriers to entry are removed for the first time for example, the Tuskegee Airmen being allowed to fly combat missions, there's sometimes a discussion about the idea of how breaking barriers might be a problematic way of conceptualizing these moments. Are there other ways of framing these important moments that might be more useful or complete?
Thank you for the question. I don't know if I think this is where you're going, but when we talk about in my class briefly, Jackie Robinson integrating Major League Baseball, what I remind students is that Black folks were qualified from day one to play in Major League Baseball. But you're just recognizing when white people decided, oh, okay, Jackie, you can come and play for us. So I think that's the thing when talking about the Tuskegee Airmen, they were already qualified. So I think when we talk about this breaking barrier stuff, it is often presented as this is the first Black person who was qualified to do X, Y, and Z. No, they were qualified a long time ago. This was when white people decided to open up their doors.
Thank you. How do you deal with the broad criticisms that have come against the teaching of Black history by vocal conservatives? And the two examples cited here, we could go on, but the two here are Tucker Carlson and Rush Limbaugh.
Let me say this. I tell people, don't laugh at this. I was a big Rush Limbaugh fan. I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh every day. And the only thing me and Rush Limbaugh agreed upon was Jesus. And if we talked about Jesus for more than 10 minutes, we may have a departure there. But let me tell you why I listened to Rush. Didn't agree with him, but I understood, follow me now, I understood that Rush spoke for a portion of white America who had no voice. I understand. So I listened to him. I think he was a brilliant entertainer, a very brilliant entertainer. He was gifted at what he did. So I don't think the attack is upon Black history. I don't even think the attack is upon critical race theory. Let me tell you what I think the attack is upon. For 4 years, I was vice president for diversity and community engagement here at the University of Texas, all right? Managed a staff of 400 people. I think we had the best programs of any organization in the country, both in the corporate space and in the academy. But here's what I started seeing. The Gender and Sexuality Center reported to me at the university. So they would do these trainings like, anti-sexism training. I remember going to one of these trainings, and the whole tenor in the room was that if you are a man, you are automatically sexist, all right? Went to another training around allyship for the queer community, and the whole tenor in the room was that if you were heterosexual, you were probably homophobic and you had to unlearn all that kind of stuff, all right? And I told some of my colleagues, y'all going way too far with that because you're indicting people even when they walk in the room. So the people came to learn, not to be indicted. So my feeling is that, and we really see this at the K-12 level, there are some diversity hustlers out there. Hustlers. They're not trained. They are hustlers and they are pimps. And what they do, they find a very naive and thirsty school board who was looking for some kind of diversity training, and they bring people in there who are unqualified, and they do crazy stuff like this. They'll have all the teachers get up. They'll do this thing called the oppression walk, right? If you had two parents, take a step forward. All this kind of stuff, where the end result was people were made to feel bad because they were white. And so in my teaching, it's not about making anybody feel guilty. I want to teach the history. But so we have got to look at that K-12 stuff, because like I said, these folks been getting these diversity contracts, and some of the stuff they were doing is completely reprehensible, and it wasn't productive, and it wasn't educational. It was just a way for them to make money.
Thank you. Our next question, again, likes the Monopoly analogy. Thank you. This person says they teach all across Louisiana to middle, high school, and college university students, public, private, and charter schools. I am a white retired businessman and history buff. What are your top 3 book recommendations?
Well, first of all, in my classes, all we use are autobiographies. I'm sorry, colleagues, nobody wants to read a dense monograph. I'm sorry, I don't want to read it, and I'm 50, all right? So we use all autobiographies, and there are some great autobiographies out there. And so what I would say, it depends on I would say the demographics of the school or the audience in many ways, you're dealing with. So if I'm doing some work with a white corporate audience, and if I'm doing 3 or 4 sessions with them, what I'll do, I'll go find a book written by a brother or sister in corporate America describing their experiences in corporate America because it's something they can relate to. So again, I would go strictly autobiographies because I really believe that's the only thing students will connect with.
Thank you. Michaela Patrick, just curious, and I don't know if you'd have an answer to this, but if students get offended by a white or non-Black teacher saying the
N-word?
Yeah. There are 2 versions of it though. The N or N-word while teaching or reading documents. Is there, Negro, sorry. I have never, as a historian, I am not familiar with that abbreviation. While reading or teaching documents, is there best practice, for working around this?
No, just to be on the safe side, you can just skip the word, just to be on the safe side. And what frustrates me is when some of my white colleagues get mad and they want to say the word. Well, why can't I say it? Why can't I say the N-word, Leonard? It's in the text. Well, why do you want to say it that bad? So I would say just skip it and avoid the controversy. But there's something wrong there. Where, if you're really adamant about wanting to use the word and your defense is, it is in the text. So I would just skip the word. That way you have no controversy.
Sounds very prudent. Stephen Ellis, I want to echo the sentiment of this presentation being brilliant. I hope to apply some of these lessons when I enter the teaching profession, and thank you.
So let me say this. When you all teach, let me say this real quick, Julia. You got to hit the door with excitement. You have to. Some of these classrooms I walk in, the students are bored to death. And so I told some of my colleagues, it may be better for you to go be at a research institute somewhere, but you should be excited. Every Tuesday and Thursday when I wake up in the morning, I can't wait to get to the classroom. And the students feed off that energy. But if you're coming in there dead and dry, here's you do. Give a lecture to your spouse and say, am I boring? And if she says you are boring, then you got to bring some excitement into it. All right. But you got to hit the door being excited what you are about to present. And you can't look at teaching real quick. When I was in grad school, they still use these phrases, what's your teaching load? As if teaching is a burden. Why would you
we actively try to steer people around that when we get submissions to the magazine and stuff. So yes.
Yeah, no, we want to teach. All right, thank you. Thank you, Julie.
2 more. One is a simple question that I can answer. And the other one from Josh Ashton Miller. Hello, Josh. Maybe I was really lucky growing up in New York State in the 1970s. I always remember learning about Black history. Mm-hmm. It strikes me as disingenuous when white people complain, we never learn this in school. Schools don't teach this. Really? Right. My school's taught it. What is your sense about how many states have required Black history in their curricula over the last 50 years?
You really saw it. Going to be Northeast, Midwest. It was taught. It wasn't required at my high school. My high school was 70% Black. It wasn't required. It was an elective. You all see it on the West Coast. But in the South, for the most part, they're not teaching anywhere. When I moved to Texas in 2007, let me give you a statistic. If you look at all the kids in pre-K in Texas right now, about 70% of them are going to be Latino. 75% mostly of Mexican American. So when I moved here in 2007, didn't know much about the Mexican American community. And I would ask my students, how many of you all took a Mexican American history class? Said it was never offered. And so in a state where that culture is so rich, right, where we won't even acknowledge the history of Mexican Americans, it lets me know that we got a ton of work to do. Mm-hmm.
And 2 more. We have, one is, yes, there will be a recording of this that will be posted on the AHA's YouTube channel, and we'll probably have it mentioned. I think we'll mention it in the AHA member email that goes out every 2 weeks as well. But yes, we're recording it. It will be available to share with your colleagues. Great idea. That's a great idea. I support that. And then the last one we have right now is from Dan McInerney, who's an old friend of the AHA and a colleague, thanking you, and says he's thinking about the Virginia gubernatorial race and the helicopter parent and those fears of indoctrination, which seem to be widespread. Do you recall how the parent explained why she was wrong about your class. Like when she realized she had been wrong about your class, what wording did she use?
I mean, she used the word that she felt her daughter's going to be indoctrinated. And I think the number one thing is nobody wants to sit up in a classroom for 15 weeks and have the finger pointed to them the whole time. And I tell people, you know, people think my Black Power class, oh, hating white people. No, I think the Black Power movement was just the opposite. It was about Black people, you know, taking pride in themselves, right? And trying to do for themselves. So I think it's the indoctrination piece. And I just think we got to have, here's the thing. All the students in my class, it is my job to make them feel comfortable, That doesn't mean we sugarcoat the history, but I think you just have to go through this deliberative process, right? Particularly those that are skeptical of saying, hey, and here's what I love to use for my white evangelical Christian friends, all right? And I grew up in a Black evangelical church. Here's what I tell them when they talk about we shouldn't be discussing this bad stuff in history. Here's what I tell them. I said, what's the worst thing? I said, first of all, do you believe the Bible is the infallible word of God? They say yes. I said, okay. I said, what's the worst thing Moses ever did? They say, well, he killed somebody, okay? What's the worst thing David ever did? Well, he slept with Bathsheba, had her husband killed, and then got married to her. What's the worst thing the Apostle Paul did? Well, he was present at the stoning of Stephen, one of the first Christian martyrs. I said, okay, so if we believe in Jesus and the Bible is the infallible word of God, why did God think it was important to talk about the ugly aspects of Moses' life, of David's life, and of Paul's life? I said, because when you talk about redemption and being redemptive, and let me take it back to the United States, we can't talk about how far we've come until we deal with the ugliness. And that's how I get it across to people. And they say, man, that's a good point. They don't like when I go to the Bible on them, but sometimes I have to.
Thank you. And the last comment is, again, thank you from someone who is not a history professor, but an artist, and says that this has been profoundly helpful.
Thank you.
And we're a little bit over time, but not too bad, I think.
All right.
Thank you all very much for coming, and do look for the recording, and please feel free to share it. And congratulations, Leonard Moore, on your book that's out. If you want a more extensive printed version of, there you go. There you go. You didn't even set me up for that, and there it is.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right.